She arrived freezing and penniless for a job that never existed. He needed a wife, not a worker. What happened next melted both their frozen hearts. The winter wind cut through Margaret's thin coat like 1,000 frozen knives as she stepped off the stagecoach in Silver Creek, Montana. Her fingers trembled, not just from the biting cold, but from the desperate hope that clung to her heart like morning frost on window panes. The advertisement she clutched in her gloved hand had promised employment as a housekeeper on a cattle ranch, and after 3 months of searching for work in various towns, this was her last chance. At 26 years old, Margaret knew what people saw when they looked at her. Her reflection in shop windows told the story her mother's voice had repeated countless times. Too heavy, too plain, too unmarketable for marriage. But she had learned to build walls around those wounds, focusing instead on what her hands could do, the work she could provide, the value she could offer beyond her appearance. The ranch office sat at the edge of town, a weathered building that matched everything else in this frontier settlement. Margaret pushed open the door, grateful for even the modest warmth inside. A thin man with spectacles looked up from his desk, his eyes widening slightly before his expression settled into professional politeness. "I'm here about the position," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The housekeeper job, advertised in the Denver paper." The man's face shifted uncomfortably. "Ah, yes. Well, there's been a slight misunderstanding about the nature of that position." Margaret's stomach dropped. She had spent her last dollars on the stagecoach ticket. The temperature outside was dropping as evening approached, and she knew no one in this town. "What kind of misunderstanding?" she asked carefully, before the clerk could answer. The door behind her opened, bringing another gust of freezing air, and a man who seemed to fill the entire room with his presence. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched with gray at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered by sun and wind, carved with lines that spoke of hard years and harder choices. "This her, Raymond?" the man asked, his deep voice rolling through the small office. "Mr. Thornton, I was just explaining. I'll handle it." The rancher's eyes settled on Margaret, and she forced herself not to look away, not to shrink under his examination. She had endured worse scrutiny in finer parlors back east. "Walk with me," he said, and it wasn't quite a request. Margaret followed him outside, her heart hammering. The street was nearly empty, as twilight settled over the town, painting everything in shades of blue and gray. The advertisement wasn't entirely truthful. Thornton began, his breath creating clouds in the frozen air. "I don't need a housekeeper. I need a wife." The words hung between them, like ice crystals suspended in air. "I don't understand," Margaret said, though. She was beginning to, and the understanding made her chest tight with a mixture of humiliation and something else she couldn't name. "I'm 42 years old," Thornton continued, his gaze fixed on the mountains in the distance. "I've built a ranch that spans 3,000 acres. I have cattle, horses, good grazing land, and a house that echoes with emptiness. I've tried finding a wife the conventional way, but the women who come west are looking for gold strikes or adventure, not a rancher who smells like horses and whose hands are too calloused for piano keys. So you lied in an advertisement." The anger in Margaret's voice surprised even herself. He turned to face her then, and she saw something raw in his expression. "I did, and I'll pay for your return ticket anywhere you want to go, plus wages for your trouble and time. But before you decide, I'm asking you to consider the offer, not as some romantic notion, but as a practical arrangement between two people who might benefit each other. You don't even know me, Margaret whispered. I know you traveled alone in winter for a job. I know you didn't turn away when you saw me, didn't simper or pretend. I know you're angry right now, which means you've got spirit. That's more than I knew about most women I've met at church socials. Margaret's hands were going numb inside her thin gloves. Her feet ached from the cold, seeping through her worn boots. She had 17 cents in her reticule and no place to sleep tonight. I won't be treated as property, she said firmly, and I won't be made a fool of. I wouldn't expect either, Thornton replied. I'm offering a marriage, legal and proper, with respect and partnership. You'd have a home, security, and your own life. I ask for companionship, someone to build something with. The rest, that would be up to both of us in time, if it ever felt right. The wind picked up, and Margaret shivered violently. Thornton immediately shrugged off his heavy coat and draped it over her shoulders. It smelled like leather and pine smoke, and something else. Something that spoke of wide-open spaces and steady presence. The offer for the return ticket stands, he said quietly. But it's getting dark, and the temperature's dropping. At least come to the ranch for tonight. Get warm, have a decent meal. You can decide in the morning with a clear head and a full stomach. What choice did she really have? Margaret nodded, and something that might have been relief flickered across Thornton's weathered face. The ranch house sat in a valley surrounded by snow-covered hills that glowed silver under the rising moon. It was larger than Margaret expected, built of solid timber with smoke curling from 2 chimneys. Warm light spilled from the windows, promising warmth and safety from the brutal night. Inside, the house was simple but well made, with sturdy furniture and floors that didn't creak. Thornton lit lamps while Margaret stood awkwardly in the main room, still wrapped in his coat. I'll start a fire in the guest room, he said. Kitchen's through there. Help yourself to anything. I'll make supper once you're settled. The guest room was small but clean, with a real bed covered in thick quilts and a window that looked out over the valley. Margaret sank onto the bed, her body finally registering just how exhausted she was. When had she last slept in a real bed? The rooming houses she'd stayed in recently barely qualified as shelter. She washed her face in the basin Thornton brought, changed into her only other dress, and tried to calm the storm of thoughts whirling through her mind. This was madness. She should take his offer of a ticket and leave at first light. But to go where? Back to her mother's house where she was reminded daily of her failures. To another city where she'd spend weeks searching for work that never materialized. When she emerged, Thornton had supper laid out. Beef stew thick with vegetables, fresh bread, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the chicory stretched version she'd grown accustomed to. They ate in silence at first. The only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside. Why didn't you marry before? Margaret asked finally. Surely in all these years, Thornton set down his coffee cup carefully. I was married 17 years ago. Sarah was beautiful, delicate, full of dreams about ranch life that had nothing to do with the reality. She lasted 2 years before the isolation and hardship broke her spirit. She left on a spring morning, and I never saw her again. Got divorce papers a year later from San Francisco. The pain in his voice was old but still present, like a scar that ached in cold weather. I'm sorry, Margaret said softly. I learned something from it, he continued. Pretty dreams don't survive harsh winters, but strength does. Two people who see each other clearly and choose to stand together anyway. That survives. And you think you see me clearly after one evening? His gray eyes met hers. I see a woman who's been underestimated her whole life, who's learned to rely on herself because no one else offered, who's got more courage than most men I know, traveling alone in winter for uncertain work. Am I wrong? Margaret's throat tightened. No one had ever described her as courageous before. I see a man who's lonely, she said quietly, who built something impressive, but has no one to share it with, who's desperate enough to lie in advertisements, but honest enough to offer escape routes, a man who's afraid of making the same mistake twice. Thornton's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. We see each other then. That night, Margaret lay under the warm quilts, listening to the house settle around her. She heard Thornton moving in another part of the house, his footsteps steady and unhurried. There was something comforting in knowing someone else was there, another heartbeat in the darkness. She thought about all the times she'd been overlooked, dismissed, quietly devastated by the casual cruelty of people who judged her worth by her waistline. She thought about her future stretching ahead like an empty road, each year making her more desperate, more diminished. And she thought about Thornton's offer, not romance, but partnership, not passion, but rispe. Maybe that was more honest than most marriages anyway. Morning came cold and clear, the sun turning the snow-covered world into blazing diamonds. Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. She dressed quickly and found Thornton already at the kitchen stove. "Thought you might be hungry," he said without turning around. They ate breakfast together, and then Thornton showed her the ranch properly. The barn housed 20 horses, their breath steaming in the cold air. The cattle were in the lower pastures, dark shapes against white snow. He introduced her to his two ranch hands, grizzled men who nodded respectfully and didn't let their eyes linger inappropriately. "It's beautiful," Margaret admitted, watching the sun climb over the mountains. "It's hard," Thornton corrected. "Winters are brutal. Springs bring floods and mud. Summers are hot and dusty. Fall's decent, but short. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. Town's 8 miles, and in heavy snow, you can't get there for weeks. It's isolated and demanding and sometimes soul-crushing in its loneliness. Why do you stay?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I built it. Because when I wake up and see those mountains, I feel like I'm part of something bigger than myself. Because the work matters and the land responds to care. Because it's mine in a way nothing else has ever been." Margaret understood that more than he might realize. The longing for something of your own. Something that couldn't be taken away or diminished by others' opinions. "I'll stay," she heard herself say. "Not forever. Not without conditions. But I'll try. For 6 months. A real marriage legally, but separate rooms until and unless we both decide otherwise. We treat each other with respect and honesty. If after 6 months either of us wants to end it, we part ways amicably and you help me establish myself wherever I choose." Thornton extended his hand. "That's more than fair." His hand was rough, warm and steady. Margaret shook it, feeling like she was stepping off a cliff into unknown air. They married 3 days later, in the small church in Silver Creek, with Raymond the clerk and his wife as witnesses. Margaret wore her best dress, cleaned and pressed. Thornton wore a suit that looked uncomfortable on his rancher's frame. The Reverend kept the ceremony short, perhaps sensing this wasn't a typical love match. But when Thornton slipped the simple gold band on her finger, and said, "I'll do my best by you." Margaret felt something shift in her chest. The weeks that followed established their rhythm. Margaret managed the house, cooked meals that Thornton praised genuinely, organized the chaos of bachelor living into comfortable order. Thornton worked the ranch, came home for meals, and spent evenings reading or mending tack, while Margaret sewed or wrote letters to a cousin back east. They talked. Small things at first: the weather, the cattle, supplies needed from town. Then deeper things. Thornton told her about building the ranch from nothing, about his father who died when he was 16, about the responsibility that had shaped his entire life. Margaret spoke carefully about her childhood, about being the daughter who disappointed, about learning to find worth in what she could do, rather than what she looked like. "You're beautiful when you talk about things you love," Thornton said one evening, and Margaret's hands stilled on her sewing. "You don't have to say things like that." "I don't say things I don't mean." His gray eyes were serious. "You get this light in your face when you talk about the books you've read or the garden you're planting for spring. That's beautiful. The rest is just packaging." Margaret didn't know how to respond to that, so she focused on her stitching. But something warm bloomed in her chest. Winter deepened, and with it, their connection. When Margaret fell ill with a fever, Thornton sat up 2 nights straight, changing cool cloths on her forehead and coaxing broth into her. When a blizzard trapped them inside for 5 days, they played cards and told stories and discovered they both loved terrible jokes. The moment everything changed came on a bright March morning. Margaret was feeding the chickens when one of the horses spooked, breaking free from the corral. Without thinking, she moved to calm it, speaking in the low, soothing voice she'd learned, worked with animals. The horse settled, and when she turned around, Thornton was watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. He crossed the yard in long strides and stopped in front of her, so close she could see the lighter flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "I know we said 6 months," he said quietly. "I know this started as an arrangement. But Margaret, somewhere in these weeks, you became the best part of my days. I wake up looking forward to coffee with you. I come in from the cold, grateful for your warmth. This house stopped being empty and became a home. And it's because you're in it." Margaret's heart was racing. "Thornton, I'm not asking you to feel the same," he continued. "I'm just telling you the truth, because we promised honesty, and I can't keep pretending what I feel is still just partnership." She looked at this man who had seen her clearly from the start, who had offered respect when the world offered dismissal, who had kept every promise he'd made. She thought about how her heart lifted when she heard his step on the porch, how she caught herself watching him work and admiring his strength and steadiness, how safe she felt in the life they were building together. "What if I do feel the same?" she whispered. "What if I'm terrified because I never thought anyone would want me this way? But when you look at me, I feel like I'm enough exactly as I am." His hand came up slowly, giving her time to move away, and cupped her cheek with infinite gentleness. "You've always been enough, Margaret. More than enough. You're everything I didn't know I needed." When he kissed her, it was soft and careful and full of promise. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks, but they weren't sad tears. They were the release of years of believing she was unlovable, the joy of being proven spectacularly wrong. That night, Margaret moved her things into Thornton's room, and they began their marriage in truth. There was awkwardness and nervousness, but also laughter and tenderness, and the bone-deep rightness of two people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and open hearts. Spring came to the ranch, bringing wildflowers and new calves, and the garden Margaret planted with Thornton's help. Summer followed with long days and shared work and nights spent on the porch watching stars emerge. When fall painted the aspens gold, Margaret realized she'd never been happier. "No regrets?" Thornton asked one evening, pulling her close as they watched the sunset. Margaret thought about the freezing girl who'd stepped off the stagecoach desperate and alone. She thought about the journey that had led her to this valley, this man, this life. "Only that I didn't find you sooner," she said honestly. He kissed her temple. "We found each other exactly when we needed to. That's enough." And wrapped in his arms, watching the sky turn from gold to purple over the mountains, Margaret knew he was right. Sometimes the best love stories didn't start with passion or romance. Sometimes they started with two lonely people, brave enough to see each other clearly and build something rare from that honest foundation. Their love hadn't been struck like lightning. It had grown like the aspens on the hillside, roots deepening slowly until they were strong enough to weather any storm. And that, Margaret thought, was the most beautiful thing of all.